My name is Andrew Lindell. I'm from Aladdin Knowledge Systems and Bar Ilan University in Israel. I'm going to talk about anonymous authentication, something which is a contradiction in terms, but we'll see that it's one that can actually be fulfilled. I'm going to start with something completely different, which is just going to be motivation, really, for why we would want anonymous authentication. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about chat rooms. I think there's something wrong with the mic. I'm going to talk about chat rooms, which, as everyone knows, have been a huge success for youth, but at the same time, for anyone who's a parent, it's a huge concern for parents. And why is that? Based on a recent survey by actually a very serious research institute called the Crimes Against Children Research Center, they discovered that 34% of children received unwanted sexual solicitations over the internet, and many of those through chat rooms. What's perhaps even more scary is that 4% of all children received sexual solicitations that went beyond something online and were actually through some sort of physical or at least offline contact, maybe calling them over the telephone or sending them a package or actually trying to physically meet them. That's 1 in every 25 children, so that's a very, very scary thought. At first, we might think, well, why is this happening? Firstly, chat rooms are supposed to be anonymous. So firstly, why would it bother us so much in any case that online sexual solicitations are taking place? Well, obviously it's disturbing to the children, but beyond that. And how do we get that 4% actually become offline? And there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that approximately a third of the children that were interviewed actually posted personal information online. They had no awareness there was actually a big problem to do such a thing. And what's even more concerning is that even when children or users are aware that they should not be posting personal information, with very little work it's possible to actually find their real persona. Another example of this is what's happening with college students in social networks, where even if they're responsible and not actually posting their personal information, they talk very freely about what they do, about their college experiences, where they took drugs. And prospective employers are now actually searching the internet to do background checks on potential candidates. And there are a number of employers who've explicitly stated they saw that a certain person had posted at a social network that they had done something inappropriate during their college years, which I assume that many, many people actually have also done, and therefore didn't give them the job. So the first lesson is that people are unaware of the fact that they shouldn't post personal information, but even when they don't and when they are aware, it's actually very easy to find it. For example, some people might use their Yahoo ID in their social network or on the chat room, thinking that just from that ID that they can't get to them, no one can get to their real persona, but it's actually very easy by going through Yahoo. So these issues are really, really problematic, and they're becoming more and more so. What are the solutions? Well, there's no actual solution, no full solution, but we can look at a number of different things. First and foremost, education. People have to understand that what they post and what they say is not private. It's very, very not private, and can also actually often get back to them. Parental control when we're talking about children, obviously law enforcement, and the type of solution I'm going to be referring to here, and what's a double-edged sword, is the technological solution. So one proposal is to set up safe chat rooms that require authentication. And we'll give these authentication devices to high school students. VeriSign had a project like that, and they were going to use one-time passwords. They gave out OTP devices, set up safe chat rooms, and in that way we would hopefully prevent pedophiles from getting into the chat rooms because they wouldn't have the authentication device. Now this solution is actually a little bit problematic. I mean, it has its downside as well. If the children now think that anyone inside that chat room can be trusted, then if someone does manage to get in, say steal an OTP device or in some other way, then it can be a bigger problem. But definitely as a first step, it's something which makes a lot of sense. Other suggestions have been to use perhaps a biometric device which actually measures that the person who's wearing it is a child, and then allow access. So there are a number of possible solutions which are running around authentication, and it sounds like a very, very good first step. And I think it is a very good first step where it's possible. But now it opens a whole new can of worms. One of the most attractive properties of these chat rooms is anonymity. Children, teenagers, even college students are under immense peer pressure. And often in their real world life, they can't say exactly what they want. They can't speak freely. They're afraid of the ramifications. So they go online. And online they can act freely, speak their mind. Of course, they can also use this badly, but in a positive way, they can actually be themselves. They can ask advice on sensitive issues and feel that it's not going to come back to them. But once we make them authenticate, once we make them sign up for an authentication device with their real name, and we give them something physical, they have to use that physical device in order to get into the chat room, then all their anonymity is lost. Now you might say, okay, but the website, the web server, the service who's running this chat room, this safe chat room, doesn't have to publish who the user is. But that doesn't make any difference, because we know that inadvertently often information goes out. Even if we trust that service, that they don't want to leak our information, do we really believe that it's safe and no one can get to it? Once we have to go through that step of physically authenticating, we start having doubts. And we may not also completely trust them. So in order to protect ourselves, we're giving up on something else which is very important. And of course, we don't want to do either. We do want to protect our children, but we also want to have privacy. And that's where anonymous authentication comes in. It's a contradiction in terms, because authentication and security in general is all about knowing exactly who is in our network, exactly who's coming, and why they're allowed in. Do they have the permissions? What permissions do they have? When did they come into the network? When did they leave the network? That's what security is all about, and that's what authentication is all about. So how can I talk about authentication without knowing who the user is? It seems like nonsense. But if we think for a minute, we realize that authentication isn't necessarily about knowing exactly who the user is. It's about knowing what their permissions are. It's just about knowing whether they're allowed in or they're not allowed in. Of course, if there are personal permissions, then that's something different. But if we're talking about some sort of web service that you have to subscribe to, then all the server really needs to know is that this person has subscribed. This person is allowed in. It doesn't care exactly which user it is. It doesn't make any difference. And the idea of anonymous authentication is that the user will authenticate to the server, and the server will be convinced that it is an authorized user, but it will not know at all which authorized user it is. Of course, the first question is that really possible? It sounds very difficult. Of course, the answer is yes, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So I'm going to talk mostly about that today, how we can actually build such a system. Before I go further, I'd like to give a couple of other applications beyond the chat room. Professional forums today are becoming very popular. I can go, in my research, I can download papers. I can ask questions. I can discuss technical issues. They're used by researchers, developers all the time. What we don't necessarily think about is that they're also a great source of industrial espionage. Because if someone looks at what papers I'm downloading, what I'm reading, what I'm asking, what I know to answer, they can actually know a lot about what I'm working on. And if I'm working on some secret project, some new product line, then just by looking at what I'm interested in, it's possible to guess what it is that I'm trying to do. And that can be, of course, of great advantage to a competitor. So one possibility is to use anonymous routing, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. But what happens if this service needs registration or even payment? I'm not going to register from scratch each time. It's impractical. It's time-consuming. If it needs payment, even more so. We need to authenticate to this service. Then again, once I'm authenticating, I'm caught, and anyone who wants to try and get my information, or at least the service knows my information, and it's something which I want to try and avoid, I'd like to have anonymous authentication. Two other possible applications. One is whistleblowing. We want to make sure that an employee can really report something without ramifications. And unfortunately, even though the law says that you're not allowed to take revenge upon an employee who's a whistleblower, it happens in practice. And so we'd like to allow any employee to report, but we want to make sure that it's actually an employee, that it's not someone else who's just coming along and reporting something that they don't really know anything about. So again, we'd like anonymous authentication. Social networks I talked about, we want to prevent those employers from using the social networks of college students as a source of information for background checks. If we need authentication on those sites, then again, we'd like anonymous authentication. Another issue that I'm going to talk about is revocable anonymity. Because, well, first of all, let's be clear, we don't always want anonymity at all. If I'm talking about my organizational network, my private network at work, we don't want anonymity at all. We need to know exactly who's there. Anonymity is for other purposes, for, say, websites, for my what I'm doing online, for exactly the examples I gave beforehand. But even here, even when I want anonymity, sometimes I want to limit it. Because let's think about the case that I do use anonymous authentication, and consider the case that one of the users is harassing others. So what I'd like to do is simply cancel their account. But I can't because I don't know who they are. I'm talking about using anonymous authentication protocols that provably protect, cryptographically protects the user, guarantees the user that it's an anonymity. So once I'm doing that, then the server has no way of knowing who it is that's harassing the others. So we'd like to sometimes be able to revoke anonymity, for example, through some court authority. The court authority, through a court order, could revoke anonymity, but no one else can. And again, cryptographically it's protected, so nobody else can, even if they want to. Even if they want to bypass. It's not like wiretapping, where you supposedly need a court order, but you could do it without that. You'd just be breaking the law. Here, without that court order, you wouldn't be able to do it at all, because that court has some secret key which enables it to revoke anonymity, and nobody else knows the secret key. That was the outline for my talk. I'm going to start by talking about privacy in general and why it's important. You may be thinking, well, everybody here at BlackHat believes that privacy is important. I don't have to convince anyone. What I'm going to try and do is give a much more concrete perspective on privacy. Often people feel that privacy is important for very vague reasons. I want to be very, very concrete, because our understanding of why privacy is important has great ramifications on the solutions we provide. Sometimes we give privacy-preserving solutions which actually don't solve the problem at all, because we have a misunderstanding of what the dangers of a loss of privacy are. I'll then talk very, very briefly about anonymous web surfing, and I'll be very brief here because there are a lot of other talks in this track that are going to focus on it, and I'm going to use it only as an infrastructure. I'm going to assume that it exists. And then I'll go into anonymous authentication in detail, define what it means, what I'm asking for, and show how it can actually be achieved. And then I'll talk about some extensions to revocable anonymity and other things as well. So let's talk about privacy again from a concrete perspective. So as I said, everybody here agrees that privacy is important, but why? If you ask the average person on the street, even one who really believes that privacy is necessary and important, they don't really have a good answer as to why. If you push them and if they think for quite a bit, they'll tell you that it's an invasion into their personal space. So if I had an argument last night with my wife, and everybody in my neighborhood heard the argument and knows about it, even though I wasn't expecting that to happen, I feel that that's an invasion into my personal space. Because it happened within my four walls, and somehow what happened within my four walls, within my personal space, went out. And that's a loss of privacy. Warren and Brandeis termed it the right to be let alone. Simply the right to be let alone. It's a personal feeling. It's really an emotional issue.